Good evening, everyone. My name is Gaëtane Vernat, and I'm the director of the power plant. So the power plant acknowledges the traditional keepers of the land on which it was built, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and the Six Nations of the Grand River, Huron, Wendat, Métis, Anishnaabes, Haudenosaunee, and any other nation who cared for the land that we share. So thank you for joining us tonight for a special presentation of our international lecture series in partnership with Images Festival, Mercer Union, and Typology. The International Lecture Series is a long-running program of the Power Plant, which invites the most dynamic artists, curators, critics, and thinkers from around the globe to present their work and ideas to Toronto audiences. Tonight's lecture was made possible through the very generous support of Nancy McCain and Bill Morneau, our 2015 and 2016 International Lecture Series lead donors. And I would like to express my deepest gratitude to both of them for their ongoing support of our gallery and of this program. And I'd like you all to know that public programs at the power plants are generously supported by our primary education sponsor, CIBC. And I'm always happy to thank our partners at Harbourfront Centre, together with our institutional partners, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, and the Toronto Arts Council. Last but not least, I thank BMO Financial for supporting our all-year, all-free access to our galleries. I thank them for making our gallery free for all public throughout the year. All lectures in our series, as well as our other programs, are free to members and their guests. So I always encourage you to become a member and to take advantage of this as one of the many benefits of the exciting and engaging membership program that we develop throughout the year. I'm now pleased to introduce Joshua Human, our Curator of Education and Public Program, who will introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Sven Lütticken. Thank you very much.
It is, as Gaëtane mentions, my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Sven Ludekin, art critic and historian who teaches art history at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, where he coordinates the Research Master's Program in Visual Arts, Media, and Architecture, Critical Studies in Art and Culture. Ludekin is the author of Secret Publicity, Essays on Contemporary Art from 2006, Idols of the Market, Modern Iconoclasm and the Fundamentalist Spectacle of 2009, and most recently, History in Motion, Time in the Age of the Moving Image of 2013. Tonight, Sven will discuss a range of practices from artistic and other contexts that analyze modern and contemporary forms of motion study, motion tracking, and motion capture. Exploring the ways in which motion has been made efficient and mined for value, his lecture will draw comparisons between Picasso and Drake, the Constructivists, and Harun Farocki. This Saturday, Ludekin will lead a workshop, again in partnership with Images Festival, Mercer Union, and Typology, titled Motion Captured, which will take place at 401 Richmond Street in room 440. The workshop will extend tonight's conversation in an intimate setting, taking a deeper look into motion study through a close reading and discussion of several short texts. The workshop is free with a ticket to tonight's lecture, but only a few spaces are left. So if you're interested in more information, please visit thepowerplant.org. But for right now, I ask you to join me in welcoming Sven Ludekin.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Gaëtane and Julia and Adrienne and all the power plant people for this invitation and for this opportunity to basically try something out with you and for you. I'm going to basically present you with the first somewhat sketchy iteration of an avenue of research that I'm interested in pursuing, that I've started to pursue, but it's early days yet. And let me set us off by reading out a wonderfully grim and glum passage from a text by T.J. Clark to you. The essence of modernity, from the scripture-reading spice merchant to the Harvard iPod banker sweating in the gym, is a new kind of isolated, obedient individual with technical support to match. The printed book, the spiritual exercise, coffee and Le Figaro, Time Out, Twitter, tobacco or its renunciation, the heaven of infinite apps. All this apparatus is a kind of extension of clockwork. Individuality is held together by a fiction of full existence to come. Time out is always just around the corner. The deepest function of this new chronology is to do work on what used to be called subject positions, keeping the citizen subject in a state of perpetual anticipation and thus accepting the pittance of subjectivity actually on offer. End of quote. So in my talk, I will deal with the temporal objectification of the subject, which in turn produces subjectivities. My talk will span the Fordist and the post-Fordist regimes, and I will, as was already mentioned, deal with three strands or three types of practice: motion study, motion tracking, and motion capture. Motion study, which is mostly associated with Fordism, though not limited to that. Motion tracking is understood here in the sense of real-time motion tracking dependent on computation, so a more recent form of practice. And motion capture is a term mostly associated with contemporary digital motion capture, of course, but it comes with certain historical predecessors. So I'll also place these more recent forms of practice in certain genealogical constellations. Now, these three strands come with different inscriptional technologies, to use a term employed by Nicolas Salazar-Sutil, different inscriptional technologies that involve different forms of transcription and of visualization. However, what I'm dealing with here, the aesthetic component of these practices that I'm dealing with is not just limited to the visualization or the representation of labor, of activities. This is too limited an understanding. We're dealing with procedures that go beyond recording labor to reconstituting it, and through labor, the laboring subject is reformed and reconstituted. More recently also the consuming or the prosuming subject. So we have this dialectic of representation and production, or reproduction and production. The productive technologies under discussion are not external to the phenomena they notate and transcribe. Okay, so let's get started with motion study. And of course, when we say motion study, we do tend to think, quite rightly so, of Fordism, of the form or forms of motion study pioneered by Frank and Lillian Gilbreth in around 1910, 1920. And of course, when we think of the media and the technologies used by the Gilbreths, one could think of film, for instance. And here we seem to have motion study in a nutshell. The various activities that come with with different jobs are being timed, but they are not just being timed, which would be the Taylorist approach. So in contrast to Taylorist time study, the Gilbreths pioneered motion studies. So it goes beyond clockwork, it goes beyond the stopwatch. The stopwatch, of course, is being used, but the point is not just to analyze, a certain amount of seconds that a worker needs to perform a certain activity, and then to reduce the amount of time needed for said activity. The point also is to look at the motions that are being performed. So it's not just time, it is time as articulated by true human movements. And by looking at these movements, by analyzing them, the amount of time needed to perform those jobs, those activities, can then, of course, ultimately be reduced. This, of course, is still very much the aim of the entire operation. But in addition to film, the Gilbreths also used photography to analyze these movements, the patterns, the recurring patterns used by workers in their so-called chrono cycle graphs. So here we have a synthetic overview of a single movement, or let's say a pattern in a single image. Of course, here we see double images because these are stereo chrono cycle graphs that can give you the 3D image if seen in the right manner. And here we can see, this is being demonstrated here in this film, that the Gilbreths, of course, famously used electrical lights, small light bulbs, to create these chrono cycle graphs and stereo chrono cycle graphs. So because of the length of the exposure, the hand movements or the movements of the entire human body draw these arcs, draw these patterns, and then the, let's say, expert in scientific management can analyze these movements and can suggest more efficient ways of doing the same job, thereby reducing the time. Of course, here, this film has a very different function than the previous film, because this film really is kind of an instructional video, if you will, that shows the making of these Gilbreth photos. And here you can see that they actually also made 3D models. So here the film itself is not the primary medium. Here the film remediates the photos and also these 3D models, and gives the viewer insight into how they are being produced and used. So, okay, here we have these graphic trace forms, and of course, this kind of image shows us the extent to which the Gilbreths were indebted to Etienne Jules Marey, a pioneer of chronophotography. And of course, a lot of these images, many of these materials will be quite familiar to at least some of you, but it's still valuable, I think, to have another look at them and to discuss them in this context. Now, Marey, in the 1880s and 1890s in particular, used two distinct approaches. The graphic method, which is actually sort of the oldest method in the context of his work. It's sort of his original approach, let's say. The graphic method involved Marey either using hydraulics or let's say a pneumatic technology, pneumatic tubes, or electricity to record movements in a non-visual manner. Ultimately, of course, this does result in an image. Here on the top left-hand side, we see, of course, a graph, a visual representation of movement, of muscular movements, and the way that they change in time. So it gives you a kind of timeline. You can see that the muscular effort is sort of reduced over time as the test subject grows tired and weary. But this is not a visual representation in the sense of, let's say, figurative painting or indeed photography. It is a graphic notation, and as I've already mentioned, for these graphic notations, Marey used either pneumatic tubes that would transmit this shock to an instrument that basically traced these twitches, or he used electricity. And in fact, Marey, who was a pioneer of cardiography, also recorded the first electrocardiograms. Now, Next to this graphic method, he used the photographic method, and here, of course, we have a different form of indexicality. So we don't have this indexical push of air traveling through a tube, as with the pneumatic approach, but we have the indexicality of the photographic camera and of the photographic plate. However, as Martha Brown has argued, Marey was dissatisfied with the surplus of information that photographs reveal. So in a sense, photography was too perfect for Marey because it shows us all the details. So here on the top, on the bottom right-hand side, we have this sequence, this chronophotograph of a man walking, and by sort of timing the shutter mechanism, Marey was able to show different phases of this gait, of this movement in one image, in contrast, of course, to Muybridge, who would show consecutive images. Here we have this parade incorporated into one sequential image, but again, for Marey, the problem was that we see all kinds of sort of details that are not really relevant to the analysis of the movement as such. So Marey came up with this kind of purification, you might say, of photography that you see on the top right-hand side of the projection, where we have a similar gait, a similar walk cycle, but here the walking subject has been reduced to a kind of stick figure. And Marey, of course, as many of you will know, achieved this by basically drawing lines, by cladding his subject in a black dark costume, and by drawing lines on the relevant parts of the body, thereby creating this graphic purification of photography. Now, of course, Marey, particularly with those images, had a significant impact on the avant-garde of the years around 1910, 1915. The Italian futurists created many compositions that are clearly derivative of Marey, you might say, or that transpose Marey into an explicitly aesthetic artistic framework. And Duchamp, of course, with works such as Nude Walking Down a Staircase, likewise, well, aestheticized Marey, you might say, or homed in on characteristics of Marey's work that were perhaps not the characteristics that were the most important ones to Marey himself, because, of course, Marey, stemming from physiology, was all about analyzing movement in a scientifically valid manner. And here on the bottom left, we see this later photo that was taken not by Duchamp, that was taken of Duchamp by a photographer named Elliot Elizophon in 1952 for Life magazine, which in a sense transforms Duchamp's nude descending a staircase back into a Marey-esque photo using Duchamp as the subject, not nude in this case, walking down a staircase. Right, so we have this, let's say, dialogue between Marey's early motion studies, you might say, which then fed into the explicitly Taylorist or post-Taylorist practice of the Gilbreths in the service of making labor more efficient. We have that kind of genealogy, but we have also the genealogy that goes from Marey into the avant-garde, into Duchamp's work, the work of the Futurists. And then, of course, a third lineage, you might say, from Marey via the Gilbreths takes us to architecture, the Bauhaus. And here, for instance, we also encounter the importance of the domestic sphere, the importance that was accorded by the pioneers of scientific management and efficiency to the domestic sphere. So the kitchen became another kind of factory, basically. The kitchen, too, the sphere associated with female labor, with reproductive labor, had to become more efficient. And here we see, for instance, a couple of tracts, a couple of treatises from Germany, illustrations from those tracts there on the in the top layer, which again show us a kind of stick figures that show inefficient and efficient ways of performing domestic labor, of working in the kitchen in particular. And then we have two model kitchens that have been designed in order to be efficient. So alternatives to the kitchen of old that was seen as being archaic. And the one on the right-hand side is the famous Frankfurt Kitchen, a Bauhaus kitchen essentially, designed by Margarete Schutte-Lihotzky. And then a slightly 1920s by Lillian Gilbert, the kitchen practical, so designed by Lillian Gilbert herself after the death of her husband. She, of course, continued their work focusing on the domestic sphere because there her activities as an efficiency expert were more acceptable, shall we say, in the 1920s than they would have been in the industrial sphere, where it was sort of Frank Gilbert who had to, in a sense, almost act as a front for their joint practice. But of course, that stopped with his untimely death. Right. Now, we also have a different form of, let's say, Gilbrethian Fordist motion study in the Soviet Union, in the early Soviet Union, with the work of Alexei Gustev in particular. Here you see two illustrations, one, well, photograph again, and then a graphic image there at the top that show us the parallel endeavor that was undertaken in the 1920s in the Soviet Union for what amounted to, well, another form of Taylorist efficiency, right? This is the era of Politcult and the era of the cult of the productive worker, of the worker hero. But of course, this could not be simply an issue of individual heroic workers who, you know, could and were served up as models to their peers, but the workers also had to be guided to perform their repetitive movements in as efficient a manner as possible. So here, you know, this photograph is very much, is clearly not a chronocyclograph a la Frank and Lillian Gilbert. It's clearly a photo that, well, with some added graphic marks, no light bulb was used here, but I still have to look into the exact techniques that were used, and it's slightly more difficult to access if you don't read Russian. Of course, this Soviet version of Taylorism, or of Gilbretism, you might say, was also severely criticized in the West precisely by radical left-wing communists. So just as a little footnote, I've added the cover of a book actually from the 1920s that was republished much later in Holland, using this composition by Gerd Arndts for its cover, this radical council communist critique of Soviet Taylorism, which was basically used by the council communists as further proof that the Soviet Union was not a real Soviet Union, not a real union of workers' councils, but it was in fact sort of a Taylorist party dictatorship. Right, so we have all these iterations and all these genealogies of motion study, and of course we have continuities on the one hand between the scientific study of movement in the service of either capital or of the Soviet bureaucracy and artistic practice. We have continuities, transformations. We also have contrasts here in this montage, which actually sort of replicates what is a very popular montage that you can find all over the internet. People love making these juxtapositions between photos by the Gilbreths and then these light paintings by Picasso or by Man Ray there on the right-hand side. The Man Ray photo, of course, is a work by Man Ray, whereas the image of Picasso drawing with a flashlight it was part of this photo session that was again produced by a photographer working for Life magazine in 1949. And I guess part of the allure, part of the charm of this kind of juxtaposition is that it does indeed seem to suggest that there is a whole range of practices that share certain characteristics, that share certain properties. But on the other hand, it also suggests that the artist still uses these methods for aims that are ultimately incompatible with Taylorist or Gilbrethian efficiency, right? Because clearly what Picasso and Man Ray do here is they use this kind of, well, light drawing or light painting, this kind of photography to produce patterns that are clearly not in the slightest interested in efficiency. They're clearly interested in exploring the sort of calligraphic potential of this wandering line of light. So in that sense, it is, of course, a counter-Taylorist, a counter-Gilbrethian practice. Artists are, of course, subjects that are that have been presented throughout modernity as specialists of wholeness, right? In the modern division of labor, it is the artist's job to be undivided. It is the artist's job to be unalienated. And here you might say it appears to be the artist's job to transform the alienation of Taylor, of Gilbert, back into, well, free expression, into a wandering line that follows the artist's whim and whimsy. So in that sense, it is sort of a highly ideological staging, you might say, of the freedom to create with this new medium. Now, you might still say that these practices do constitute a kind of counterpoint to Gilbert, to Taylor, but of course this counterpoint was always compromised. Perhaps, working within a certain system, any kind of response to a dominant or hegemonic form or practice will always be compromised a priori. This should, of course, not be an excuse to not engage with such a practice in a serious manner. And another sort of example of this kind of compromised alternative is Rudolf von Labanz's work. Now, Rudolf von Labanz will be known to many of you as the pioneer of, or the developer of the Laban notation, Laban notation, which played such an important role in modern dance, in making sure that modern choreographies could actually be transcribed and transmitted to others. And Laban's practice developed around 1910, 1950, 1920 in the context of German Lebensreform, of German Körperkultur, of dance reform. So Laban's modern dance, like sort of the dance of his close peers at the time, very much aspired to create a more healthy and wholesome, unified, organic body by developing movements that would be the opposite of alienated, Chaplinesque, modern time style jerking movements in a factory, right, alongside the conveyor belt. So in these exercises on the one hand, and then fully developed choreographies on the other hand, the male anti-female body was supposed to develop in ways that would indeed be a counterpoint, or would constitute a counterpoint to the crippled and mutilated bodies that you could observe in the modern factory. And I kind of rather love those two photographs. The one at the bottom here actually has a caption in German saying, "Gut durchgearbeiteter Körper in ausdrucksvoller Stellung." So a well-developed body in an expressive position. And of course, there is also a certain classicism at work here. Laban and others certainly also Isadora Duncan, notably looked back to ancient Greece and tried to create a modern living equivalent of the idealized bodies of classical antiquity. But these ideas really had to come alive. The frozen bodies, the frozen poses of antiquity actually had to become living reality. Now, to jump a little bit in time, here we or I've made a little montage between this page from a book showing Labanz's early work to a page from a much later publication by Labanz. So there's 20 years, basically more than 20 years between those two publications. The one on the left indeed shows us this very idealizing focus on die gut durchtrainierter Körper in ausdrucksvoller Stellung. And the page on the right shows us an example of Labanz's work with a kind of alternative approach to motion study in the 1940s when he was in exile in the UK after first sort of flirting with fascism and trying to come to an arrangement with the Nazis in the early 1930s. He finally realized that there was no future for him in Germany, and he emigrated to the UK. And there he started to collaborate with specialists in the field on projects in what he termed effort study. So we go from dance reform to effort study as an alternative for Gilbrethian motion study. Now, in Labanz's effort study, the emphasis is on, and I quote, the effort capacities displayed in the functions of man's bodily engine. A nice mechanical metaphor there. And the rules which govern their economic and efficient application. Okay, so efficiency, economy, so far so Taylorist or so Gilbrethian. But of course there had been a lot of opposition to Taylor and Gilbert style scientific management because of the suspicion that mechanical efficiency also exhausted and destroyed the worker. So we can tell the worker, if you do it this way, it's more efficient, we'll save time, you'll be more productive, we'll make more profits. But of course, this actually can, of course, completely deplete the worker's energy and actually lead to an early death. Now, Labanz tried to come up with an alternative that would do greater justice to the worker as not just a machine, but actually an organism and a human being. And in the context of this holistic focus on individuals and on their potential as well as their defects, he basically developed what you could call a human resource approach that points beyond the Gilbert's pure quantification. And here we see the new type of notation, or the new notation system that he developed in order to basically illustrate this effort analysis, both to actually perform the effort analysis, but also to transmit his findings and to illustrate his findings. So he came up with these hieroglyphs, basically. There on the top, you see that there are basically two fundamental axes. So we have the horizontal axis, which is that of control, and control can basically go from fluent on the left to bound on the right. So a movement is either very fluent or it's bound in the sense of more like sort of a staccato movement. And then there's the vertical axis of exertion, and the exertion can be either strong, heavy, lifting, heavy labor, or it can be light on the top. But then he came up with these sort of qualifying indications, a time indication, so a movement is either sustained or quick, and a space indication, so it's either flexible or direct. And this then results in these, hieroglyphs that are actually quite difficult to read. So when I'm sort of trying to decipher them, I tend to go, look, why don't you just write it down? That's quicker and easier. But clearly he was convinced that these graphs, these ideograms, these hieroglyphs were actually, let's say, a more successful way of let's say, a visual, somatic way of transcribing movements than mere language could possibly dream of being. And perhaps if you really put in a great effort and really become fluent in this idiom, it does make sense, but so far I haven't really gotten there. Now, one interesting aspect of Labanz's choreographic approach, you might say, to motion study is that he focused not just on industrial labor, not just on, let's say, the conveyor belts. He also focused on office work. Of course, the same is true for the Gilbreths, but Von Labanz made a couple of particularly interesting observations on mental workers, office workers, intellectual laborers, what have you. I quote, "When the office worker has become used to the burning up of nervous tissue without the relief of bigger movements, his performance will be less disturbed by the addition of emotional shadow moves. It is the same with a child who has become used to sitting quietly at a desk." So you need to train this. You need to train yourself basically to be able to do labor that is not terribly expressive in physical terms. And what he means by shadow moves are essentially sort of symptomatic movements, tics, neurotic tics that survive in office work where no real visible rhythm appears to exist. So part of his work was basically trying to get rid of these shadow moves and to get the office worker to basically accept the fact that this is not a sort of very physical type of labor, but nonetheless that there is a form of rhythmic control in office work as well as in industrial or manual labor. So individuals, according to Von Labanz, all have different abilities and different biases, and you need to prevent the subjects, the individual's effort habits from getting out of hand. So somehow the subject with his or her proclivities and biases has to be adjusted, has to come to terms with whatever the nature of the job at hand is. There is a rather brilliant description and analysis in his book of a meeting chaired by a person he describes as an enlightened industrialist, and it's sort of almost sort of a little play. It's very theatrical. He describes how the antagonist, so the enlightened industrialist's antagonist, attacks the industrialists vigorously with intensive cutting and hitting shadow moves, so these shadow moves again, and the chairman answered with quiet, smoothing, gliding efforts and occasional sharp dabbing gestures. So it's a very choreographic approach to motion study, and it does not involve stopwatches, and it does not involve let's say, a lot in the way of advanced technology, but it really relies on the trained choreographer's eye, as far as I can see, at least for a lot of its findings. Now, a different kind of sort of contemporary choreography of labor can be found in this recent work by the artist duo Revital Cohen and Tuur van Balen. This is their project 75 Watt from 2013, which is a choreography they designed for a Chinese electronics factory. So they basically came up with a product that does not serve any function, and they composed a choreographer for the workers working on the conveyor belt. So it's a kind of reverse. Oops, let me just turn off the sound. It's a kind of reverse motion study that does not try to make the work more efficient, but that rather tries to basically mess up the routine and to really focus on the movement as movement that may have qualities that have nothing to do with efficiency. So it's indeed a kind of counter-proposal to this culture of efficiency. Of course, it is also a somewhat exoticizing and patronizing intervention in this Chinese factory designed to be consumed by iPhone-using art world denizens. So it's a rather problematic work in that respect, I would say, but this is also something that we could discuss. Now, just to continue on this choreographic theme for a little while, choreography also sort of comes into contemporary culture and the contemporary economy, the sort of contemporary techno-science as a driving force of our economy in a different manner, in that increasingly companies, corporations seek to patent certain movements. So this, for instance, is from a patent application by Apple. Apple attempted to take out a patent on the swipe that you use to unlock your iPhone, and originally they were granted this, and I think they probably still hold it in the US, but in 2015 they lost a challenge in the German court system, their patent for this swipe to unlock gesture was voided in Europe. Now, this, you might say, is a new form of extraction. It's no longer just about the optimization of movements in order to increase efficiency. Now, certain movements can be protected legally in order to make sure that others cannot use them, so that this movement is really your intellectual property. And on the right-hand side here, we see a patent, again, by Apple, a patent that has been awarded to Apple that covers, reading here from the text, an incredibly broad array of gesture-based controls. So this would sort of be the next step in computing. Presumably, you no longer even have to touch the screen to swipe anything, but you can actually gesture towards your computer. The computer will register your movements, and thereby you can sort of give commands. You don't have to touch the keyboard. You don't even have to touch the screen. So efficiency here has been redefined in a sense as the efficiency of the software, the efficiency of the technology, and the efficiency of the company in actually protecting their software and their whole design as their intellectual property. So it's no longer the worker basically who's being mined for value. It is now proprietary software on the one hand, and then the user on the other hand. And users' movements, of course, are also increasingly being tracked in actually a neo-Fordist attempt to once again increase their efficiency. So here again we actually return to a kind of Taylorist or Gilbret style approach with key logging, for instance. So companies can actually basically track every move that their workers make on their desktop or laptop using key logging software. And of course, in this way, they can have a look at what it is that they're actually doing. Do they send private emails, or visit websites with cute kitten videos rather than working? But also the companies just can track the productivity as such. So how fast are they actually working? Are they efficient workers? So there is a very sort of neo-Fordist type of motion study, motion tracking in contemporary office work, contemporary intellectual labor. And of course, this is a form of monitoring that also raises a lot of ethical questions, even though these are not really being discussed to the extent that they would deserve to be. I'm now sort of transitioning from this first strand, from this first genealogical strand of motion study to the second one, which is motion tracking. And in this context of motion tracking, it is also highly significant that we see this rise in fitness trackers that companies hand out to their employees. not necessarily forcing them to wear them, but certainly stimulating them to wear them. And of course, wearing them, using them can come with certain benefits, insurance benefits, for instance. So if you use this kind of wristband to track your health data, this is an illustration from that was published in The Guardian last year in 2015. Giving us certain sort of statistics. Most companies with more than 500 employees will offer trackers in 2016, is the prediction. So if employees use these wristbands, these trackers, they can get better conditions on their health insurance in some cases, and there can be other benefits. Now, it's not just a matter of tracking let's say, the amount of time that you spend in working or resting. It's not purely tracking, let's say, different blocks of time that make up your day. It's also very much keeping track of movements you make and of the amount of movement, the amount of exercise that you sort of incorporate into your daily routine. So motion tracking as basically a whole array of technologies that of course can have certain benefits in terms of people with chronic conditions being able to keep track of whatever they need to be aware of. So it can help people tremendously. It can help save people's lives. But of course, these technologies are not merely about assessing health risks. They are also very much about assessing financial risks. People become walking financial liabilities, ticking time bombs. And basically, if you want to prove that you are a viable, productive subject that has the right to good conditions on your health insurance and what have you, you will increasingly pretty much be forced to toe the line and subject yourself to 24/7 monitoring, 24/7 time and motion tracking. Now, we are, of course, all cyborgs, right? This is not about some kind of a Luddite or nostalgic longing for a time when we were completely autonomous individuals. It's no longer about this kind of early Labanian ideal of the pseudo-Greek subject. But of course, what kind of cyborg are we, and what precisely is the nature of the assemblage that we form with our technologies, or the assemblage that is being formed for us with our technologies? This is another illustration from a mainstream news publication, the German weekly Der Spiegel, or it's from the Spiegel Online website. Actually, in English, funk system sounds rather wonderful. The Metronoma funk system. Of course, it's German. It's a funk system, so it's a kind of radio or transmission system, a wireless system. And this illustrated a story about the new generation of smoke detectors. And so the new generation of smoke detectors can no longer just it will no longer just ring the alarm when there's smoke, but it can actually track people's movements throughout the house, and it can sort of pinpoint a person's location in a house. It's that sensitive, and of course this again raises various concerns about privacy, about surveillance, and another form of contemporary motion tracking, movement tracking, and location tracking. And I'm just sort of illustrating these rather briefly in order to get around to Harun Farocki's video film, the creators of the Shopping World from 2001, and a couple of related films by Farocki, because Farocki is, in a sense, or was until recently, up to his sad and untimely death, one of the artists who are most most involved in coming to terms with responding to contemporary forms of basically control through technologies of motion inscription and transcription. So in Die Schöpfer der Einkaufswelten, Farocki shows us the sort of design process of a couple of shopping malls, and he shows a sort of an existing shopping mall being revamped and refitted, and he shows us various technologies that were being used around the year 2000 to monitor and to improve consumers, shoppers' movements in and through those malls. So one technology that was being used, for instance, was a video camera at the ceiling, filming the shoppers from above, and then basically transferring or transforming the video image into data. So identifying a certain moving dot as one shopper, one customer, and then basically doing the maths and providing the owners with those data. And then the other technology was basically eye tracking studies using a computer simulation of a mall. So here we see two stills from that sequence from the creators of Shopping World. So there's this kind of computer simulation of the mall in question, and then a test subject's eyeball movements are being tracked, and then it turns out, okay, 87% of subjects look here first, and then the eye wanders over there, or doesn't even just wander, it goes over there in a straight line apparently, or at least in 53% of all cases. And of course, in this way, the outlay, the layout of shopping malls can be improved, can be made more efficient. So here we have, in the context of contemporary real-time motion tracking, basically a new post-Fordist form of motion study that is again all about efficiency, but in this case about the efficiency of the whole shopping operation, the efficiency of consumption rather than production. The two stills on in the top layer of the image are from different works by Farocki, Deep Play and Ich glaubte Gefangene zu sehen. I thought I was seeing prisoners, which just illustrates the extent to which Farocki engaged with forms of motion tracking. In each case, basically moving subjects, moving individuals are being transformed into moving dots, moving data. So football players on the field or prisoners in a courtyard. This is sort of a very prominent motif in Farocki's work. And of course, it is a critique of those forms of tracking, of surveillance, of subjectification, of subjectivation through those technologies of inscription, of reproduction and production. It is a critique, but it is not a critique that pretends to position itself outside of this culture, outside of this constellation. It is a critical position within this field, this evolving set of contemporary practices. And it is an artistic practice that perhaps allows us to at least begin to think through some of the issues, aesthetic, political, ethical issues raised by these developments. And these developments also really have a direct impact on art, on curating, on the ways in which institutions are being run. This is basically motion tracking in exhibitions, in museums. So the, let's say, flow of visitors in exhibitions is also increasingly being subjected to a new form of motion study that uses various technologies of tracking, of real-time tracking. Not so much in this case, but in a couple of examples that I'll show a bit later on. Now, I would just briefly like to raise the issue of or raise some of the, address some of the ramifications that come with this culture of efficiency, essentially, in exhibition making, in curating, in art making. If we think back to the fact, if we consider the fact that the modern art institution, the white cube, and all the practices that it allowed for, also all the practices that it disallowed, but I'll leave those aside for the time being, that the white cube and the associated practices were actually intended as a kind of counter model, right? Very much along the lines of the Picasso and the Man Ray photographs. The white cube, the exhibition space, the art presented in those spaces and developed for those spaces was an art that was the negative mirror image of the alienating forms of labor that characterized the industrial age and Fordism. The white cube was supposed to be the space where the modern subject goes to fight alienation, to at least temporarily and symbolically, all too symbolically, overcome it. And there's actually a link, a strong link also with these early choreographic practices such as Rudolf Von Labanz. I'm showing you an image here of a recent work by Ian Whittlesey, who's looked into the Maznaznan cult, the Maznaznan religion that was developed in the early 20th century and that had a couple of prominent adherents among early modernist or avant-garde artists and curators. So Johannes Itten, most famously perhaps, was a total believer in this sort of made-up religion, this modern post-theosophical religion. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy came under its spell during a certain period, and Willem Sandberg, the legendary director of the Stedelijk Museum, who actually turned the Stedelijk Museum spaces into white cubes in the 1930s, was or adhered to this Mazdaznan religion, which was based on the old Persian religion of Zoroaster or Zarathustra, which is a kind of Manichaean religion. It's all about lightness, about light and dark. The light is good, dark is bad, dark is evil. So it involved a kind of light cult, but it also involved a set of breathing exercises. I'm reading from Ian Whittlesey's sort of description of his project, which involved him having art students do some of those Mazdaznan breathing exercises in an exhibition space. Many of Johannes Itten's students converted to Mazdaznan, and together they practiced the exercises advocated by Hanisch. This was the sort of self-styled guru of Mazdaznan. The simple movements and breath control techniques were designed to activate glands and rechannel internal energies, stirring the blood in ways that contributed to the perpetual evolution of humanity. The exercises were also said to result in auto-illumination, the participant body generating light from within that would be visible to any onlooker. So you're really supposed to become radiant, apparently. Now, I find it really interesting that Whittlesey is sort of returning to those early modernist practices on the sort of, let's say, in this area where occult and esoteric practices and the avant-garde overlap, because he returns to this idea of art as actually being a counter model and a counter example to alienating, repetitive, destructive Fordist industrial movements. Now, in the contemporary art space, again, we have this culture of efficiency, of the very experience that was supposed to be the symbolic alternative to alienation becoming subjected to neo-Fordist types of motion tracking that ultimately, I would say, amount to another form of motion study. And this is a project by the artist Jonas Lund, who has actually installed a software that is used, that has been used by museums to study the ways in which their visitors use the institution and to optimize the flow. He uses that software and he has actually installed it in an exhibition. So what is normally hidden, what is normally not accessible to the exhibition visitor, to the museum visitor, here becomes part of the exhibition. And you may well wonder whether this mere act of making this visible in an exhibition, of kind of doubling this technique by incorporating it in a show is in itself enough, but it could again be a first step towards coming to terms with those tendencies. Okay, I'll gloss over that. I think I'm in the process of running out of time, right? How much time do I still have? 10 minutes? Okay, I'll try to be slightly more concise. This is a project by Dora Garcia, Instant Narrative, that perhaps takes us a step further than this project by Jonas Lund. So here the museum visitors or the exhibition visitors are actually being observed by a typist, a writer sitting behind a MacBook here. And so it's not, it's not software, motion tracking software mapping the space and converting people into dots and into numbers. There's this sort of narrative that then emerges here on the screen. People are being described, but it's not straight description. Sort of dreamlike elements seep into this ongoing instant narrative. And in that sense, I would say this project is rather more nuanced and sophisticated, rather than converting people into data. Dora Garcia actually treats the visitors as embodied subjects that can respond to this ongoing narrative in ways that go beyond this mere registration of, okay, so we're being monitored. It's a more, let's say, Lacanian intersubjective trap for the gaze. But of course, it does not have this literal engagement. It does not involve this literal engagement with sort of the latest in surveillance technology. So in that sense, precisely this constellation of the Jonas Lund project and of the Dora Garcia project can be illuminating. Okay, I'm starting to wrap things up now. Motion capture is part of a culture that Hito Steyerl addresses in her video installation Factory of the Sun in a really imaginative and speculative manner, a culture in which movements are being mined for information and are being turned into, transformed into data, into information, not in the way in which, let's say, the Fordist subject was being transformed or was being mined for data, because there it was all about the typical, the stereotypical or prototypical movement that had to be made as efficient as possible. With motion capture, actually, it is more about the individuality of the movement. It is about specificity. It is about performance, right? It goes from Fordist labor to post-Fordist performance. And in the Factory of the Sun, Steyerl presents this kind of scenario in which motion capture slaves perform these movements, which are then being transformed into light, pure light, pure signal, and then reused countless times. And people who have been killed in protests are then revived as avatars after their death. So I'll actually skip over this. I had a few clips from the video, but I think that would take too long. But I've also made this little montage here with all these variations on the famous Hotline Bling video by your great Canadian genius, Drake. I think, Javol will be incredibly jealous because, he does not have this kind of traction. He does not have this kind of popular success. This clearly is the greatest Canadian artist of the age. But on a more serious note, on a somewhat serious note, the New York Times published sort of an analysis of the success of Drake's video and of all the sort of GIFs that were made of it and all the sort of memes that it spawned, in which the author argued that this video is less a video than an open source code that easily allows Drake's image and gestures to be rewritten, drawn over, and reconfigured. In essence, he's making a GIF of himself. So, this video, of course, at first sort of spawned a lot of ridicule because, these dance movements are so, well, simple and basic, and it's not this amazing Beyonce-style choreography. But that may precisely be sort of the genius of it. So, on the one hand, we do have, the individual performance. It's not the anonymous Fordist conveyor belt worker or even the anonymous office worker whose movements simply have to be as efficient as possible. It is a dance, it is a form of performance, but at the same time it is oddly generic, or it can become oddly generic. So, to round it up, we have this increasing focus on the labor of consumption, shopping malls, etc. The labor of actually life as a citizen. One's job now as a citizen subject is actually to constantly produce data, either for the government or corporate entities or some kind of hybrid of both. It can be, quite difficult to determine where the NSA or the CIA or the FBI ends and Apple begins, even though, of course, Apple tries to make us believe otherwise. There's this shift from the worker to the banker, to the artist, to the performer. A performer who supposedly has to express his or her individual qualities, individual quirks all the time, for instance, by making funny Drake GIFs or by mimicking him. So there is then also this sort of reversal, this dialectical flip of the specific back into the generic. But production and consumption have merged into, prosumption, into this kind of circulationist production of movements that generate data and metadata left, right, and center. Time as a medium that is embodied, that is shaped through motion, is perhaps the primary medium, the prima materia of contemporary life, but also, because of that, of contemporary aesthetic practice, of contemporary aesthetic and political practice, I would say. So something that we see here is, well, what is it? It is, not necessarily an artwork, but it is sort of a video that has triggered a set of responses that, can range from the corny to the popular to the far out and avant-garde. And again, it is very much about seeing those kinds of constellations or creating those kinds of constellations of artworks, of non-artworks, of sort of a hybrid variety of materials that perhaps hopefully allows us to think through the genealogies and the contemporary iterations and transformations and mutations of these strands of motion study, motion tracking, and motion capture. And now perhaps we can proceed to the more interactive part, and I'll be happy to respond to your questions and comments. That's it. I can also go back if we have time and perhaps show you some of those clips from the Hito Steyerl video. I don't know how well known it is, whether it was shown here in Toronto, for instance, or not.
Hi, Sven. Thank you for that terrific talk. I have a question about Walter Benjamin, strangely.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I do photography history and theory, and while you were talking both about the Jules Marais example, which you reminded us, Marta Braun makes that very interesting point that photography frustrates him because it's excessive. It gives all kinds of information that he's not interested in. It records too much. And then the example of these shadow moves that you gave that Laban wanted to eliminate from workers. I was thinking about the way that Benjamin writes about in the work of art, or the work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproducibility, that one of the possibilities of photography is revealing what he calls the optical unconscious. So this question of excessive movements that the operator can't help but make, that might say something about what's going on at the level of the unconscious, and where you see that fitting into this wonderful study you've given us. Like, what happens to those unconscious movements or excessive movements?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there is indeed, the optical unconscious is in a sense also what Marais was struggling with, I suppose, because even though his photographs didn't necessarily show us things that are not that cannot be seen by by the human eye, by the naked eye, but still just the fact that it is a very sort of egalitarian, democratic medium, that it doesn't differentiate, it doesn't necessarily create a hierarchy between what is important and what is unimportant. This was something that did bother him. And of course then indeed in the 1920s and 30s, as you say, actually this was seen as a progressive and even revolutionary property of photography and film, that you could zoom in, you could, the photos could show us microscopic details, they could show us constellations, etc. I would say that actually with the Gilbret's chronocyclographs, that we are dealing with a form of the photographic unconscious, because of course we cannot actually see those patterns, right? We can only see them because of the exposure time, because the light bulbs have been used, but we would never normally see those patterns. We can try to follow the movement and then try to imagine what it would look like, or somehow try to trace it with our eyes or with a pencil on paper. But strictly speaking, those are patterns that are unseen by the human eye, and therefore they are a form of the Benjaminian optical unconscious, I would actually say. And even, of course, if we look at Marais' walking man, if we look at that kind of tableau, tableau of a man in motion, it is also a manifestation of the photographic optical unconscious, not each individual shot, but the combination of it again shows a pattern that as with Muybridge's series of the galloping horse, is not something that actually we can really see ourselves without this mechanical aid. So actually, these are all these sort of forms, these forms of representation, of reproduction and reproduction can all actually, I think, be analyzed using Benjamin's notion, I would say. Is that a response?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for your talk. I'm interested in where all this is going, and you touch on some modernist moments, and it seems to be your intent is to explore. I think you use the word genealogy, I thought a lot about the concept of subjection. And within the modernist context, so you're subjecting a body to reducing a body, subjecting a body to points of light, to dots. And what does that mean in terms of, for a modernist, it would mean really the erasure of difference in the name of an ideology that is meant to be universal. And so it made me think about modernist painters, for example, like Picasso, who subjected female bodies to formal experimentation, reducing body parts to spheres, sometimes to dots, And so there was an erotic component to that, for sure, and a masculinist component to that. And so, and there's a certain amount of fetishism going on too. So I think you can sort of transfer the primitive fetishism, primitivist, to, you know, maybe it's a different kind of fetishism associated with technologies.
Yeah.
I mean, to do with light.
Right.
Or code. So, and I suppose it's just a general thing that I've been, I was wondering about.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I welcome that kind of response because, basically I'm also using you as audience tonight as guinea pigs because, this is something that I'm just basically starting to work on. And I always think that, I'm never really comfortable doing a lecture over and over again and presenting an audience with something that basically I've already finished with, something that I feel I'm in complete control of. I think that this is ultimately, it's not necessarily pretty, but it's hopefully more engaging. And this is a very interesting point or set of points that you raise about the sort of the fetishization of the subject, or actually the erasure also of the subject, of subjectivity. I mean, you mentioned Picasso. Some of what you said now also reminds me actually of this rather amazing poem that Laszlo Moholy-Nagy wrote at a certain point. Is this hymn to light, this ode to light, in which he sort of basically prays to light itself and says, pure light, please schenk mir den reinen Glauben, sort of give me the gift of pure faith. So it's clearly also an attempt to, or it sort of speaks of this desire to actually be absolved of the burden of subjecthood, or let's say of subjectivity. And there's this cult, of course, also of transparency in the Bauhaus and in Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. And it would indeed be interesting, I think, also to compare modernist forms of that kind of grappling with subjectivity and fetishization, going beyond fetishization even to a kind of erasure of the subject. Compare these modernist forms, these modernist iterations with contemporary iterations. And perhaps here also in response to what you're saying, it could be interesting to show a few minutes from Hito Steyerl's Factory of the Sun, because that really is a kind of ironic or perhaps sort of quasi-ironic narrative in which she really seems to advocate in a kind of techno-idealist idiom the indeed transformation of embodied human subjectivity into pure light, into light as sort of the purest form of information, of data. But it already seems to be strangely obsolete, strangely historical by now. She seems to return to this sort of 1990s Wired discourse and to a form of techno-idealism that is perhaps already quite historical in its own right. And she really seems to play with that also in the sort of computer effects that she uses. Now we're back with Mr. D. Okay, here we go. So, it sort of looks like a very cheesy, let's say, late 90s, early 2000s video in part. It has this kind of techno dance aesthetic.
This is your mission. You start off as a forced laborer in a motion capture studio. Every movement you make will be captured and converted into sunshine. 4 bots escaped from this scenario. They were shot by corporate drones during recent global uprisings.
In a statement released today, a spokesman for Deutsche Bank denied using drones to kill protesters.
Drones themselves, who are then revived as
They're shifted a few hundred kilometers to the north.
Motion capture characters. Okay, one last clip, actually a slightly longer one, starting at the 8-minute mark. This is now really finally the actual motion capture studio.
That is a very, very good diving scene. Very nice. Okay, so let's be really specific here. It's a drone. It's a flying device that has a weapon mounted on it, and it's going to shoot you. So you sort of don't know what it is. You turn to look at it. This is where the dancing thing starts to happen. This is in Edmonton, Canada. My brother started to do internet dancing in the basement of my parents' house and got a lot of attention, and then he became a star.
I'll just turn off the sound, but I'll leave it on. So yeah, it's there is this let's say this techno-idealism here that could be seen also as a return of certain forms of modernist idealism, inspired by Theosophy or Mazdaznan or what have you. So to what extent is there actually the subject dies, actually people are literally killed, but then they're revived on this kind of higher plane of existence as pure light, and the movements are actually the movements of these motion capture slaves that somehow then instill new life, new artificial life into them. But then what has happened to this subject that has been actually been killed off? I'm not, I'm not sure also to what extent your response actually was one particular question, and I'm certainly not giving you one straight answer, but I'm trying to think along and think sort of just take one more step perhaps, or half a step perhaps, in response to your question.
Excuse me, I had a question as well. I've been thinking about Janet Jackson a lot lately because I recently bought a copy of Rhythm Nation 1814, and it's an album that I haven't listened to in a long time, like the singles we know, but not the whole album completely. And to follow up on the last question about kind of an erotics or kind of subjecting oneself to restraint, I think in the Janet Jackson album, I think it kind of, I'm glad you mentioned Beyonce, because I think this continues on to a connection to Beyonce in a more contemporary context. But with that Janet Jackson album, kind of contemporary reviews, she had this huge tour about Rhythm Nation, and people said, it's the same thing every night, it's so controlled, it's pop music, it's so controlled, it's kind of subjecting oneself to really a high level of restraint. But when you really listen to the album, it's got that sense to it, but it's also really an erotic album, and it has this kind of political portrait of 1989, which it's been kind of characterized as, but it's really a lot about fucking, and she explores that later on Janet, the self-titled album in '93. So I think it's interesting because she's subjecting herself to this element of control, and then you can kind of see a BDSM thing going on. She's all black, she's in boots, she's not coincidentally dancing in a factory in the lead-off single. And I think you see that in Beyonce as well, like with Formation, where you have a very kind of militant, politicized imagery, which we saw at the Super Bowl, kind of echoing the Panthers and this kind of imagery, but it's a very kind of sexualized, self-styled, sexualized imagery at the same time. I mean, she's on a sinking police car, but she's in this very prone, sexualized position, sinking on a police car. So I think there's something about a kind, rather versus kind of what Duchamp and Man Ray were doing to women's bodies, a kind of woman in control of her own body, like a Janet Jackson or a Beyonce, who is in control of producing her albums and writing them, etc. There's this kind of pleasure in restraint, which is connected to a kind of sexuality, but also an openness that provides also a kind of window that isn't totally restrained at the same time. So, I mean, I think that's an interesting counterpoint to Drake, and I don't know, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting response. I mean, musically, I'm really out of my comfort zone here. I'm more of I'm more of a post-punk guy myself, you know, Sonic Youth, The Fall. That's so. Yeah, for me, it's a bit of a new world in a sense. Yeah, sure. I'm not completely ignorant, but it's not my main thing. Yeah.
Is this on? Yes. So I have all of these ideas sort of mashed up in my head right now, based on your talk, sort of trying to reconcile all of these different sort of approaches to motion, and sort of looking at the sci-fi aspect. I wonder if you see some of this going into what might be considered a eugenics movement toward merging or creating a spectrum between the human and the robotic, especially when you take into account sort of all the studies of human movement and expression and how that's being used in animation and robotics and cybernetics or cyborgs, as you made a side reference to.
Yeah, really interesting point. I mean, if we look back at the early 20th century, there are, of course, also really uncomfortable sort of areas of contact and complicitness between Lebensreform and Körperkultur and some forms of modern dance in Germany in particular, and eugenics, ideas about creating a stronger Volkskörper and a purified Volkskörper that would no longer contain these weak and undesirable and alien elements. So there's that. And then today, indeed, I wouldn't necessarily say eugenics, but these forms of monitoring, of control, of mining subjects for data. Of course, risk, perhaps not so much risk as also very much have sort of the aim of reintroducing new kinds of class divisions. Perhaps that's too weak a term, but the healthy and the sick. One of the co-founders of Google, once famously, notoriously said, "Hey, what's the problem with all of people's, private health data becoming public? I have no problem with mine being public." Well, yeah, that's because you're a super rich and healthy person, right? So I think there is certainly also going to be more pressure. I mean, depending also on which country you're in and what kind of social system that is. Pressure to agree to certain procedures, monitoring procedures, but also then perhaps certain medical treatments on the basis of those, if you want to be eligible for certain more advantageous financial conditions and what have you. So you have to be a good subject. You have to agree to your subjection, right? That's clearly something that I think is only going to raise more issues. It's only going to crop up sort of in a symptomatic manner in more and more contexts. So I don't know if I would necessarily go as far as calling it sort of a new eugenics movement yet, but it is a culture of constant monitoring and constant anxiety and anticipation, right? Because that's also very much, of course, what T.J. Clark addressed in this quotation, and that's sort of perhaps the continuum, across all of these genealogies and across sort of all these decades of Fordism blending into post-Fordism. There is this continuing and intensifying monitoring drive that creates a culture of constant anxious anticipation, basically suspense about, will I be able to perform this task well? Will I be able to stay healthy? Will I be able to do this? Will I be able to be a good functioning subject as a producer, as a consumer, as a prosumer? And this is now moved from sort of a still relatively contained workplace in a factory or an office to a 24/7 situation. which is a sort of a further extensification, but also a further intensification.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. So I have a little question, it's a little rambly, but just picking up on what you just said, my first thought is that people will probably start selling their healthy bodies to wear around those fitness trackers. I could just picture someone at the gym with like 5 of those on their arm being like, yeah, keep my insurance rates low, please.
Yeah.
And that
You're probably
makes
right.
me jump to the movie Gattaca, where they're monitoring everyone's DNA all the time so that they can really actually keep track. Do you remember that one? Ethan Hawke,
I
sort
haven't
of from the
seen that
late
one, I
90s.
think, no.
Gattaca. Oh yeah, you should.
Okay.
I think it would
Okay.
be up your alley. Okay, so here's my rambly question.
Good. Join the Ramblers.
Well, I'm last, so. Sian Nagai talks about weak aesthetic categories such as cute, zany, and interesting as being great at being indexical of our kind of current society, ideology, and so on. So I wonder about these small movements that we're seeing sort of with potentially with the Google gesture-based computing as maybe becoming indexical of our times as well. So the smaller gesture, the weaker gesture, containing in it a new subjectivity. And so my questions around that are sort of, does it demand a gestural conformity, so sort of a recolonizing the body? What kind of subject does this construct? Are there perhaps potentials for new subject formations? So I think that this Hito Steyerl piece is perhaps a proposition for the subject formations, but it's sort of in these much grander, larger gestures. So what of the weaker gestures? What would those suggest?
No, that's not even that rambling a question, but I'm not sure I can come up with a non-rambling answer. It's perhaps too good of a question. Yeah, so indeed, I think, part of my point is also in discussing some of these artistic responses is also to really discuss them as basically first steps. I mean, some of these projects that I've discussed or that I've shown are, I think, really strong works, like the Dora Garcia piece, for instance. But together, I think they're most of all really, incentives to actually begin to ask precisely those kinds of questions. So indeed, how to deal with these movements that have become intellectual property. Is it possible to respond to that perhaps with certain choreographic methods? Are we actually also dealing with, or will we be dealing with new kinds of shadow moves, to use Labanz's remark? I mean, I've already catch myself basically just swiping the iPhone to start it and then thinking, actually, do I even want this? No, I should put it away. It's just become so automatic. This is ultimately, this is a set of problems, of interrelated questions that are as aesthetic and potentially artistic as they are ethical and political. And I think we will hopefully, otherwise we're really screwed, but we will hopefully see a whole range of responses in those different, albeit overlapping registers of the ethical, political, and aesthetic and artistic to this evolving set of intensifying problems. So this is a beginning in more ways than one, I guess. It's a beginning as a first attempt to at least create a preliminary constellation, and it's a beginning in the sense that these strands will continue to unfold and to intersect, to interact, to strengthen each other, to morph, to mutate. So in that sense, it can only be work in progress to deal with this. Your question was better than my answer.
Very good. mind, I'll join you on stage.
Okay, sure.
Well, very good. Well, of course, we would like to thank Sven very much for his insightful talk. So please join me in giving him a round of applause.
Thank you.
We have two programs that I would like to remind you of if you don't already know about them. We hope that you will join us next Tuesday, April 5th, when we have Ryan Mayberry, a software engineer and partner at Mayberry Fine Arts and Consignor Auctions Limited, sort of, we'll say, tracking of sorts, who highlights the role documentation of artwork plays in the larger arts and culture industry through his new online platform called Art Moi. And then our next International Lecture Series program will be on Tuesday, April 12th, when Art Angel co-directors James Lingwood and Michael Morris reflect on 25 years at the helm of an organization with no fixed address. So on that note, I thank you all for attending tonight's International Lecture Series and wish you all a good night.